question I'm looking at. This may be your last socially inappropriate, close-packed event in the foreseeable future, so I don't know. Squeeze in. Anyways, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Oliver Botar. He and I have known each other for a long time. His partner, then Serena Kashevji, and I worked for 4 years on the Winnipeg Modern book, which is now out of print. We've sold 4,000 copies of that book. So by any measure, it's a bestseller. And quite frankly, that's the reward of such an intense process and project. If you want some, I have a few copies left. But yeah, and maybe there will be a time when we can reprint again. It's a fantastic textbook, and it's really a deep dive into Winnipeg's modern architectural history. In the process, I got to know Oliver, is probably the right way to say it. And maybe to describe him a little bit is to think about the exhibition that you should all go see at the School of Art, perhaps just immediately after this presentation if you haven't already. But I've seen the exhibition 3 times. The first time I saw it in his house on Kenora, where his sons were banished to either the basement or the 3rd floor. They couldn't live on the main floor anywhere, and they couldn't live on the 2nd floor, because every room in this Wolseley house was completely covered and packed with the raw material for the exhibition. Paper upon paper upon paper upon paper. It was like walking into a kind of modernist archive. And there were packages coming in from all over the world. FedEx was still shipping, not now. I don't know about that. And all this material is sort of one-off prints, original editions of books. It's just an amazing archive that only a fraction of which is actually in the exhibition because there are space limitations. So the second time I saw the exhibition was in his office in the old Taché, which is two rooms converted to become one for the faculty, I think, which is quite spacious by our standards. But the exhibit was once again deployed entirely in his office. And of course, the overlap gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and the stacks get deeper and deeper and deeper. And now what we have at the exhibition is a kind of exfoliated, shall we say, final selection of the key ingredients that represent a story about how the Bauhaus came to Canada, not only to Canada, but clearly by virtue of Oliver's research, to the University of Manitoba. So we were a central figure in the deployment of the kind of, let's say, Bauhaus thinking and attitudes and resources and methodologies in Canada. So that's really what the exhibition is about. What more can I say, Oliver, than giving you a welcome introduction for this lecture in a faculty that you should be a part of, as we all know. He teaches in the School of Art, but deep down inside, there's a dark part of his heart that's completely devoted to architecture. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'm on now, live, right? Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction, Herb. Yeah, this project has been a long time coming, and just like the Winnipeg Modern project was a long time coming, yes, deep down in the darkest corners of my heart, as you put it, I love architecture, but you should know that art historians actually are trained both in the history of architecture and the history of art. At the University of Toronto, where I went to, we had to do comprehensive examinations for our PhD in 2 fields. I chose ancient Greek and modern, and in both fields we had to do 2 sets of comprehensives, one in architecture and one in fine arts. So it's always been that way. And since my dad is an architect, I've also been very deeply you know, steeped in architectural thinking, and he was an architectural engineer actually. So and actually his teacher was an alumnus. One of his teachers was an alumnus of the Bauhaus, teaching during the Stalinist period in Budapest at the Academy of at the Technological Institute in Budapest. So there are all kinds of lines there of genealogy that brought me to this project, which actually began more than 20 years ago when I and a colleague, a fellow PhD candidate and then PhD from the University of Toronto, Anna Hudson, who was then a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we came up with a project to organize an exhibition on the Bauhaus and Canada. And she's now teaching at York University in the art history department, but we thought of this project many years ago, and at the time we tried to sell it to the then director of the Bauhaus Archiv Museum für Gestaltung, the Bauhaus Archive Museum for Design in Berlin, Peter Hahn, and Peter Hahn said, I don't think there's going to be enough material there. And in fact, when I was talking about a lecture, I gave 2 lectures last fall, one at the University of Calgary, both sponsored by the German consulates there, the University of Calgary, and then later on at the Ottawa Art Gallery on Bauhaus Canada Connections. I told this to a friend of mine in New York who's a collector and loves art, loves architecture, is a lender to this exhibition, and I said to him, I'm going to be lecturing on Bauhaus Canada Connections, and his response to me was, well, that should set you back about 10 minutes. So he's been proved wrong about 2 hours over, 20 times over, because I could lecture for hours about this. It's a huge topic. What you should know, however, is that these connections are indirect. They are not direct, but they are very real. The other thing you should know is there's no such thing as the Bauhaus. There was never a unified, what I mean by that, of course, there was a school founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius. It had a 14-year life, ended in 1933 with the rise of the Nazis to power. They shut it down. Actually, the professors themselves, under the leadership of Mies van der Rohe, shut it down. But it had a 14-year life, but it was so multifarious, it was so complex that we're just now discovering how complex it was, although we've always known that in a certain respect. The Bauhaus that we think of is the Bauhaus that was projected through an exhibition held at the Museum of Modern Art in 1938 that was organized by Walter Gropius and Herbert Bayer, Walter Gropius being the founding director of the Bauhaus. But it's also, the Bauhaus we know is a Bauhaus that was projected by the third director, Mies van der Rohe, the great architect. I'm sure you've all heard of him. And not so much the second director, Hannes Meyer, who was a communist and who was very much into ecological design. He was a pioneer of environmental design, eco-design. That's not the Bauhaus that we know that well. And we invited actually a scholar from Buffalo, Dr. Elizabeth Otto, who gave a lecture at the Mentoring Artists for Women's Art a couple of weeks back on gender sexuality in the Bauhaus. And she also lectured on the Bauhaus under National Socialism that day at the School of Art. So we've been trying to make the story more multifarious. And the exhibition, which Professor Enns mentioned, is on until March 27th. I'd recommend all of you go see it, because more than anything else, and that exhibition is about art, it is about pedagogy, it is about design, but more than anything else, it's about architecture. And within that section on architecture, more than anything else, it is about the history of this institution. The School of Architecture, later the Faculty of Architecture, it is about this, it is about your history. So I would really recommend that you go have a look at it. You need some time. There are about, I haven't even counted, Genevieve, do we know how many works are on the show? It's like 350 if you include each book. Too many, exactly. That's the operative word. We don't actually know how many works are in the exhibition. About 150 photographs and artworks on the walls, but hundreds of books which I've not dared count in the exhibition. Books, documents, and everything. It really is a deep dive, as Professor Enns put it, into a number of topics related to the Bauhaus. But I want to emphasize the Bauhaus was not one thing. And the Bauhaus in Canada was several things via the United States. That's just the way it is. So the exhibition is open actually 10 to 5, more or less, week. Officially not 10 to 4, but in de facto 10 to 5 weekdays, and I will be giving an evening tour. We've scheduled it now for Tuesday, March 24th from 6 to 8 p.m. The actual tour will be from 6:30 to 7:30, but it will be an evening that it's open. So if those of you who are busy during the day, you can come and see it at that point. So the Bauhaus is long ago became, and I'm going to just give a brief overview, not of the Bauhaus itself. I'm assuming you know about it. I'm going to talk about the Bauhaus and Manitoba and Canada, focusing on Manitoba. The Bauhaus has long ago become a global phenomenon. Since its final closure in 1933 and the subsequent dispersal of about 1/3 of its faculty and students throughout the world, the other 2/3 remained or were stuck in Germany. And also due to the synergistic relationship between Bauhaus precepts, pedagogy, and practices with modernist ideals elsewhere, the Bauhaus has been universalized, as we see here in the endless vista of international-style apartment towers in São Paulo in Brazil. And I could show photographs of a number of cities like this. And this is what we think of as kind of like Bauhaus architecture, boxy buildings, right? Research on this globalization is extensive, with books and exhibitions devoted to the Bauhaus, clockwise from top left, in France, the Czech lands and Slovakia, the United States, Israel, the Netherlands, and Hungary. These are just the most obvious cases. In fact, there have been other publications about Australia, India, various African countries, Latin America, definitely, all over Latin America, Japan, China, and so on. But recent scholarship has also emphasized, especially in an exhibition which closed recently entitled Bauhaus Imaginista, which is about the fact that it wasn't one-way influence from Germany leading outwards, from Europe leading outwards. In fact, there were all kinds of what the Germans call Wechselwirkungen, interactions, interchanges, that affected the Bauhaus as it was developing during this period. It's curious fact that apart from the exhibition currently on view, there has been very little commemoration of the anniversary in Canada. There was an exhibition up for a week in Edmonton last September, which focused on the wonderful work of Wynne, Rule and Wynne, a fantastic architectural firm, but with absolutely no connections to the Bauhaus at all. Not indirect, not direct, anything. Still fantastic work. And some examples of furniture. It was barely advertised, barely known. There was an exhibition of EQ3 furniture at the Ottawa Art Gallery last November for about 3 days. That was it. And there was a lecture and film series in Vancouver, a lecture that I gave in Calgary, and I gave a lecture for the opening of the EQ3 exhibition at the Ottawa Art Gallery. That's all that I know of. So this is really it. And it's called Bauhaus Canada 101, of course, because it's the 101st anniversary. We couldn't fit it into last year's schedule, but also because I imagined it as kind of an introduction, like an introductory course, like a 101 course. It's a university gallery after all, which is also why I dare stuff it full of stuff, because it's didactic. It's not meant to be elegant, although I still think it's kind of elegant. It's not meant to be elegant as much as it's meant to be useful for students and for faculty in learning about this and also asking questions. Professor Enns and Serena Khashoggi's project, which was a fantastic project I'll get to in a minute, really what it did is the door was opened by Professor Kelly Crossman of Carleton University, who wrote the first important article, scholarly article on the history of modernism in this province and this city. But that book opened up doors. It asks questions, essentially. Even the articles that are published ask more questions than they answer. And there are still so many questions. One of the biggest ones, as we'll see, being the history of interior design at this school and in this province, which is an enormous subject which has not been given its due so far. As far as I know, only 3 Bauhäusler, which is the German term for Bauhaus alumni, all of them former students settled in Canada. This is in contrast to the United States, where it was about 40, 50, 60, nobody knows for sure. But even more settled in Mexico, more settled in Australia, nobody wanted to come to Canada. Canada was and is a backwater in many respects. Less so now than it was then. After the Second World War, definitely was a backwater. Much more so than, let's say, Argentina or Brazil. kind of the way that we're a backwater still, which is demonstrated by the fact that the pandemic has not reached us yet. But it will, just like in On the Beach, that great novel about the nuclear fallout spreading around the world, it will come here. So we're kind of living in a dream world still, because because epidemiology dictates that, as Professor Enns pointed out, this may be one of the last opportunities that we have to get together in a situation like this. Those three were Werner David Feist, a significant Bauhaus photographer who became an advertising executive in Montreal; Andor Weininger, a relatively important Bauhauser, particularly in Oskar Schlemmer's Bauhaus stage; and his wife Eva Fernbach-Weininger, one of the few women who, through sheer persistence, entered the furniture-making workshop at the Bauhaus. These two, this couple, settled in Toronto for 8 years. As soon as they got their Canadian passports, they emigrated to the United States. The next day, they wanted out. Canada was not friendly to these refugees in the 1950s. Oops. So it was maybe 4.5 Americans, or German Americans, Hungarian Americans, who were former Bauhaus people, who determined more than anything else the effect that Bauhaus thinking, Bauhaus ways of thinking, determined Canadian architecture and art subsequently. And these are the four main persons. Walter Gropius, the founding director of the Bauhaus, who became chair of architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. In 1937, he hired Marcel Breuer, a Hungarian who was both an architect and a furniture designer, the guy who developed tubular steel furniture. Essentially, we're all sitting on tubular steel chairs here. Still, these are not Breuer designs, but that's where they derive from. He taught there till 1946, at which point he set up his own firm in New York and became one of the most important progenitors of brutalist architecture in the world. That's a subject which is not treated in this exhibition, although it could have been a whole exhibition on its own, because I'm convinced that his brutalist style had a huge effect on Canadian architects, on buildings, everything from Scarborough College at the University of Toronto to a number of buildings here in the city as well. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the third director of the Bauhaus, who taught at the first, what was known as the Armory Institute, later the Illinois Institute of Technology, and taught until 1958. And then Laszlo Moholy Nagy, another Hungarian, was a founding director of the new Bauhaus in Chicago. And then later it was just renamed the School of Design, and then the Institute of Design in Chicago, who taught a couple of architects. Ralph Rapson was one of them, but none of the Canadian architects studied there, but a number of Canadian artists, and particularly art educators studied there, who they later brought some of those ideas back to this country. A couple of Canadians studied with Josef Albers at Black Mountain College, none, as far as I know, so far at Yale, which is where Josef Albers taught later on, but so that's a secondary story. Compared to the plethora of structures designed by Mies and Breuer, the latter often in collaboration with Gropius in the United States, relatively few structures were built by them in Canada. Breuer was responsible for two relatively minor, though very fine, building complexes, a fishing camp and cottage complex in an isolated island in northwestern Ontario east of Lake of the Woods, which is almost completely unknown in the Breuer literature itself. This photograph is the only known image of it until Professor Enns and I went there, partly by riding on the back of condors and by canoe, and flying in there and paddling in there and finding it and taking these photographs. These photographs, which are two of the ones on display currently in the exhibition, are the first publication of images of this fishing camp, this Breuer complex in the world that I know of. It's completely unknown. So that itself is a cause for excitement. Thank you, Herb, for providing us with these, for looking and finding the images. I took pictures on that trip as well, and I still have not been able to find my own pictures, but you found them. Thank you. It's a very fine building. He also built a factory in Oakville, Ontario, which is actually quite wonderful. It's been forgotten now, but it was widely published when it was first built in the early 50s, and I went to visit it last December. It's still intact, mostly. It could become a tourist attraction, even though it's just a factory building. More important was the contribution made by Mies van der Rohe at the very end of his career due to the efforts of one Canadian woman, Phyllis Lambert, daughter of Seagram CEO Samuel Bronfman, also owners of Cadillac Fairview Corporation, who literally forced her father to design the company headquarters in New York in the mid-50s, the Seagram building, and who engaged Mies in the production of the major complexes in Toronto and Montreal during the great age of modernist expansion in those cities in the late 1960s. So you have the TD Centre. Here's the Seagram building, the TD Centre. Here is Westmount Square. These are right at the very end of Mies's career. It's generally recognized that the TD Centre is a masterpiece, of one of Mies's late masterpieces. And by the way, there's a film showing at the entrance to the exhibition called City Dreamers about 4 women who made outsized contributions to North American architecture and landscape architecture. 3 of them are Canadian. Cornelia Oberlander, Blanche Van Ginkel, Phyllis Lambert, all 3 trained either at IIT with Mies van der Rohe or with Gropius and Breuer at Harvard. So this lineage is crucial also as we start to take a closer look at the contributions that women have made to architecture and to planning through the years. And Marika Gruhl is here from the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation. I think I saw you earlier, who's been doing wonderful research on this subject. We look forward to a fabulous book, Marika, on the subject in the future. But it's very, very important research that's taking place. Here is Mies van der Rohe's Nuns Island gas station, now a community center from the Nuns Island development in Montreal. And this is the TD Center, which, as I mentioned already, is really, really a fantastic. If you've never seen it, gone to look at it when you're in Toronto, I would recommend you go look at it. It is really quite remarkable. Most people would have expected that it would have been Montreal or Toronto where international style architecture should first have taken hold in Canada. But Toronto was late to adopt the new architectural ideas coming out of Europe. To be sure, it had a School of Architecture at U of T, and Eric Arthur, hired to the faculty in the early 20s and 30s, brought in people like Gropius and Breuer and Siegfried Gideon for crits. But modernism didn't take hold there. Instead, it was John Russell, a graduate of MIT, who was the key figure in transforming architectural training in a modernist direction in Canada, and that he did here at the University of Manitoba. We're sitting in a building now named after him. Building on a foundation laid by his predecessor, Milton Osborne, our grads went on to play the major role introducing Bauhaus ideas into Canadian architecture. Russell, an early MIT grad, who was first hired to the U of M in 1928, in effect took over the direction of the school in 1943 and was appointed first dean in 1946, serving in that capacity for 22 years until 1966. He was a key proponent of regional modernism and linking U of M with IIT in Chicago, Harvard, and MIT, where other important modernists, such as the Finns Alvar Aalto and Eero Saarinen, and the Hungarian György Kepes taught. And György Kepes, who was an artist and a photographer and a thinker and a publisher, taught the foundation course at Harvard. So at MIT, I should say. So he taught many of our architects, including, for example, Ernie Smith. There is a letter on display in the exhibition by Ernie Smith writing to Dennis Carter about this strange Hungarian guy with a heavy accent who's teaching these really interesting courses there. Toronto modernist architect John C. Parkin, a graduate also of our school here, recalled that when he entered the U of M architecture program in 1939, he found, quote, high standards, a competitive environment, and the dying embers of the Beaux-Arts system. And yet, as you can see in the exhibition again, a person like Harry Zeidler could graduate in 1944 with an international style apartment complex design as his thesis project. After becoming dean, Russell hired the Harvard graduates Earl Farnham and James Donahue and the IIT grad Herschel Ellarts to the faculty. The curriculum was revised along modernist lines in 1948, and again we can see the results of this. The students, the graduates, before they went to grad school at Harvard, IIT, and MIT, were already producing Miesian structures as their thesis projects. I found the thesis project of Etienne Gabouri and of Valdis Ehlers in the basement here being shat upon by mice. Hopefully this will all be transferred to archives and special collections. Gathering dust there, you look at, they're on display in the exhibition, and you can see that they're completely Miesian in their style. Russell brought in important modernist speakers and initiated a series of exhibitions with shows coming from the MoMA in New York, the Boston Contemporary Institute of Art, and the National Gallery of Canada. As Carleton art historian Kelly Crossman has written, quote, by the early 50s, Manitoba graduates and professors had begun to design and produce buildings strongly influenced by German-American modernist principles. And he says, all of this demonstrates that by about 1950, the School of Architecture had taken its place in a continent-wide revamping of architecture school curricula along the models established by Mies at IIT and Gropius and Breuer at Harvard, end quote. And this was, we were the first actually here. And we've already mentioned these projects. Also the project that Professor Enns and Serena Kashavci edited and did, and also a project by two former students of mine, Jeffrey Thorsteinson and Brennan Smith. Jeffrey's now a PhD candidate here in the Faculty of Architecture, and their project on GBR, probably the most important firm from this respect, in many respects. And this chart just gives you a fleeting idea of the depth of this contact. And if you look at the red is U of M. This is as much information as I've been able to gather about all of Canada. There's a few little bits of information that have come in since that I could have added from Vancouver, I think one other name, and I'm sure there are more, but if you look at the red, that's U of M graduates or people who taught at U of M, and then you can see, is it IIT with Mies? Is it Black Mountain College at Albers? That's Harry Zeidler. Is it Harvard Graduate School of Design with Gropius? That's blue. There's no other university in Canada architecture program that has a chart like this. This is it. This is why U of M and Winnipeg became the clearinghouse, if you like, for further influence. This is where John C. Parkin trained and then went to Toronto and founded the central firm of international style architecture in that city. It was around 1950 that John C. Parkin dates the general acceptance of Miesian principles of international modernism in Toronto. And he did this in a competition. The first building, though the really first institutional building, rather opposed to residential building, is the Ontario Association of Architects, 1954. I want you to keep that date in mind. Us, our historians, are very concerned about dates. And this is the Parkin office building. And we had James Donahue, who is a Breuer student, who brings industrial design ideas to Winnipeg, and we get the Winnipeg chair as a result. And we have all these exhibitions, the production of perspective, which was put together by the architecture students itself. The second, I would say, modernist journal coming out of Winnipeg is extremely important, publishing articles by Harry Zeidler and so on. We have the very early international style domestic architecture here, designed by Green Blankstein Russell as early as 1947. Only Vancouver had earlier international style domestic buildings, but really those come from a California tradition. It's not the tradition of the Bauhaus in specific, which I've been very strict about holding myself to this exhibition. But you have the first curtain wall in Canada, Elizabeth Dafoe Library, it's still there. You've got the, unfortunately now, late lamented engineering annex. That was a huge mistake. I do not understand why people in this faculty and elsewhere in the university didn't stand up and say no, but we were silent, unfortunately, when this building was torn down. And the early offices of GBR, this was designed while Crown Hall was being designed in Chicago by two of the students who came back during summer holidays and preempted Mies, basically, certainly from the point of view of Canada. And then we had a whole spate of buildings being built in Winnipeg, including the General Post Office, and Manitoba Health Building, Norquay Building, all Russell Building we're sitting in, all inspired by Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall. And here we have the building that we're sitting in right now, the Norquay Building, Smith Carter Associates, and there are others as well. I'm speeding up now, I don't want to take up too much time. And in domestic architecture, Breuer and Gropius's style of building was reflected in the designs of James Donahue. And here we're seeing these images for the first time in high quality, thanks to Professor Manouk, who provided me with the actual original negatives. We're seeing these high quality images. This building is still in perfect condition on Hosmer Boulevard, inspired by Breuer and Gropius designs. Interior design is a whole dimension of this production, which is barely known yet. Whether it's the work of Margaret Stinson, who's actually with us here today, thank you so much for coming, and others, Grant Marshall, Cynthia Bookbinder Coop, Joan Harlan, the founder of ID here. The graduates of that department did so much important work, and it's been mostly erased. In a few cases, it's survived, but very few. But some of the most beautiful examples are City Hall, Monarch Life, and you can see how Miesian it all is, all these interiors are, and the Winnipeg International Airport. And I think did you work on that, Margaret Stinson? No, okay, so I'm wrong, sorry. But it was in that kind of style, but we have to figure a lot. We need historians to figure this all out yet. And there's so much more, a lot of it Miesian. And I could also talk about pedagogy and the role of Arthur Lismer. It's all in the exhibition. You can go look at it, but I'm not going to take up any more time. And if there is an exhibition that was still on or was on, maybe no longer, over in Architecture 2 on Hungarians of the Bauhaus, which, is it still on? Is it down now? It's down, okay, yeah. Well, anyway, it was on for a while that you could have had a look at. So let's talk now. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Carlos Rueda, and, well, you all know Herbert Enns, and we're going to have a discussion about the legacy of the Bauhaus in Canada. So we've seen that historically it's undoubtable that the School of Architecture here at the University of Manitoba played a singular role in Canada in both training people. I haven't even spoken about the revolution in pedagogy that happened here during the 1940s that introduced some of the principles that some of the Bauhaus professors incorporated into their educational practices. But we've certainly seen from the point of view of practice and also of where the graduate students were sent, the University of Manitoba played a singular role in Canada in this respect. What are your reactions to that, or how does that legacy, if at all, reverberate through until today?
Maybe I can speak from the perspective of a newcomer, or relatively newcomer, and from someone who had experienced the legacy or the impact of the Bauhaus elsewhere in the world. To me, it was a beautiful surprise. It's something that definitely after living for over almost 15 years in Montreal, not so far, I didn't know about. And it made me think of the possibilities of an architecture that, although it's universal, responds to the specificities of place. And I think we always, almost ahistorically, debate between those two poles. And for me, it's just a recent discovery. I still don't know exactly what to do with it, but it's definitely something that should matter to us here at the university more than it does, because it's a living legacy. And because, as you put it from the start, the Bauhaus, although is something that we can clearly identify with a certain type of artistic and architectural or, let's say, technological expression is not one, but it's a source that perhaps gives us more than any other movement or more than any other manifestation in the history of modernity. That is a project that we are still in, that gives us multiple possibilities for us to develop our own, let's say, authentic ways. When you look at the Bauhaus offers you pretty much an avenue for everything, for the very vernacularly inspired, for embracing industry, for approaching art from a perspective that is completely out of conventions, and that in the end crystallizes differently. So I like to see it as an open project. That's how I like to see it. And also as a legacy that can be inflected again and can be incorporated to new concerns that we have nowadays that were impossible to see for the people of the Bauhaus themselves.
Yeah, I remember the very first drafting assignment we did, which was up in the Russell building, which living in this building alone is a kind of DNA altering experience over the many years. And it was the Chamberlain House that was in the brown image on the lower left of your images about cottages. That was kind of an assignment. And so I would say we were less a part of the Bauhaus by the time I came along, because there was competing interests, and that came out of the kind of via the Bauhaus, but through the Museum of Modern Art and Design. And they distributed in those days, in the early days, early post-war days, a series of posters to all the schools of architecture in North America that were the kind of standard template about how you should be taught design. And those were exhibited in our Manitoba, the Manitoba Modern exhibition at the WAG. So there was kind of, let's say, ideological event happening, but it wasn't cohesive. It was the influences of this building. It was having professors who'd come through Frank Lloyd Wright's colony of students, and then it was the legacy of these plates of modern design: space, light, line, void, whatever they were. These lessons of abstract thinking, controlling design. So I sort of remember that quite vividly. I don't know what the equivalent today would be. Like if we were to ask ourselves how, first of all, how we are teaching, because there's some obligation to structure an intentional landscape in the school, but also what references we bring to the table that are kind of a continuity of the past. And in that sense, I think Walter Gropius liked to say, from the city to the spoon. That was his idea of a kind of a comprehensive model of design. And I've been struggling with that for the better part of my time in school. We tried to set up the Center for Advanced Product Design a number of years ago. And in my own work, I did quite a bit of product design and even artworks. And now finally the spoon, the cutlery, but the spoons are very hard to design, by the way, incredibly hard to model in any software you might have, and maybe easier to carve in the old way. But I think for me that the kind of comprehensive mission that never came to fruition as a cohesive whole, shall we say, as you say, the Bauhaus was never a singular entity. But for me, the whole idea that design was work with all disciplines, from master planning right through to the most intimate objects in the house, is still a kind of inspiration, a bit of a directive.
Perhaps you could speak to, and something I didn't speak to because I didn't have time, it's actually not even fully dealt with in the exhibition, but that is pedagogy. And there was this phenomenon at the Bauhaus, which was called the foundation course. And let's also remember that architecture wasn't actually taught formally at the Bauhaus until 1927, until the second director, Hannes Meyer, arrived, and before he became director. But this foundation course was developed out of reform pedagogy of the early 20th century in Germany and elsewhere, partly inspired by the ideas of an American philosopher, John Dewey, learning by doing and project-based education. So the idea that rather than the old academic method, which was to copy the work of the masters through sketching maybe ancient Greek statuary, looking at ancient architecture, looking at recent architecture by the masters, rather than that, what the Bauhaus professors wanted was a tabula rasa. They wanted the students to forget everything they've learned before, after they come to this school, and just to look purely, investigate forms, materials, colors, shapes, all the rest of it, and to re-educate to re-educate the students according to very elementarist, as they called it, principles. So this idea of the personal exploration of material, color, form, space, void, is that still being carried on here in the education?
To a certain degree, and to a certain degree it's not. But there's a good reason for that. I think there are historical circumstances that made that necessary at the time, and there are other historical circumstances that make it different nowadays. The part that perhaps pervades architectural education here more than in other places, but in other places as well, is the learning through making, the hands-on component, and here is something that I can see that is still alive. The idea that you start from scratch is a bit of a myth. You know, when we look at people like the same Mies van der or Walter Gropius, they were deeply connected to the history of their traditions. You know, like Mies van der wouldn't exist without Shinto and
classicism in general.
Without the classical tradition, and that is perhaps the result of the necessity that they had to break away because they were not finding a way to express let's say, to find the architectural expression or the artistic expression of the times after almost 100 years of transition and crisis. It worked for a while. But what we also can see the Bauhaus as a new classicism. And there's nothing wrong with that. But obviously, it needs to be inflected with a number of situations that we respond to nowadays that are different from the ones they responded back then. So I would say yes. I would say pedagogically is alive to a degree, but revisionism is always good for any pedagogical process as well.
I think the biggest, I don't want to put Neil on the spot, but I think some of the Marcel Breuer's maneuvers in the dark are sort of linked in some ways to his sensibility, I would argue. And I've done a little kind of homage to this building on the Red River, where I was really dealing with, where I was really dealing with sort of, in contrast to my kind of, let's say my lake buildings, there are I think now 11 of my buildings, various places. Kind of an homage to the legacy of this school. So I think that the perpetuation of an ideology from, say, Harvard to Jim Donahue, for example, and through this building then into the work that I'm doing, I think you could develop a kind of consistent stream. It doesn't, but I'm not sure what role pedagogy plays in that specifically, although I just referred earlier to the indoctrination of modern principles at the beginning of science students. So, but I still want to be free in a way, free of obligation. But I think obviously the world is we're working out of a culture where the diaspora kind of distribution in the middle of after the Second World War. there's a complete cultural upheaval, and many of us are only one generation removed from another history entirely, so the idea of this kind of impermanence in this landscape is a little bit different. And therefore, the projects tend to be kind of inflected, I think, by a kind of new sort of cultural attitude. And I also think communications is very big. Herbert Marshall McLuhan came to the University of Manitoba and started thinking about understanding media. And I think that is a kind of an influence that can't be underestimated. Because right now, if we want to talk about Greek architecture, we can in a sense be there in 5 seconds. And we gather information like, as he just said, Tarzan's in the media forest, where we're constantly gathering information and ideas from everywhere. And I think that leads to a much more eclectic work in the school. Because I think you're more left to your own devices. Certainly when I think of my students and what they're doing, there's a kind of, if there is a continuity, I'm not sure one could argue that it's a stylistic continuity. It has to do with other kind of values and intensities.
I would like to.
That's working.
Hello. I would like to add something perhaps as a type of provocation. I really believe that we need to look into the Bauhaus carefully, and my reading of the modern movement, similar to the reading of the Bauhaus, is that it was not one, as you said from the start, and that is much more enriching when we look at the individuals and how they interacted, yes, with the general movement, than when we look at the product. So I don't like the Bauhaus as a product. I like the Bauhaus as a source to look into again. And I believe that what we developed from the Bauhaus was, unfortunately, the remaking of classicism with new technology. And what you see, what we are, is which there's nothing wrong about that, but we need to accept it. This is why did it become crystallized in something called the international style? Why did it become so widely accepted? Because it was the remake of classicism, but with a new technology. And it comes from Schinkel, and it comes from Hegel, and that is not the Bauhaus.
So it's a crucial question, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Carlos, because what I was going to say is that if we look at the 3 directors of the Bauhaus, remember the Bauhaus was not a school of architecture, it was a design school originally. It was a school of applied arts. The first director was an architect. His style, was Gropius a good architect? That's a question that's debatable. He produced one very interesting building, or a couple of very interesting buildings, the Fagus-Werk, the Bauhaus building itself. Other of his buildings, some of them are better, some of them are worse. His collaborations with Breuer are very good. Probably Breuer was the better architect. I don't know, it's a subject for debate. But he had a certain attitude towards design. It was not classical, actually. The second director, Hannes Meyer, was completely different. It is not chance that Hannes Meyer did not end up in the United States, but it is really chance that Canadians didn't study with Hannes Meyer, and I'll tell you why. Hannes Meyer, who was a communist who left Germany in 1930, moved to the Soviet Union, tried to build socialism there, ran up against the nightmare of Stalinism, and then goes home to Switzerland, is recruited to Mexico to set up an architecture school in Mexico, runs into the authorities there as well. Had he succeeded in setting up an architecture school in Mexico, I'll bet you a whole bunch of Canadians would have gone down to study with him, the way that all kinds of Canadians were going down to Mexico to study at the Instituto Allende the Institute, I forget what it's called, but this art school in Mexico, in San Salvador de Allende, I forget remember the name of the school. And the third director, who was an architect, Mies van der Rohe, was a strict classicist, as you've said, in the tradition of Schinkel and in the tradition, literally, of ancient Greek temples. And this is what we see here. It just so happens that it's that graduate school that our students went to, and the other graduate school of Gropius that our graduates went to. Had our graduates studied with Hannes Meyer, we would have had a completely different interpretation of Bauhaus architecture, because Hannes Meyer was one of the most brilliant pioneers of an ecological architecture of the first half of the 20th century. Everything he did was geared, everything he taught was geared, first of all, to collaborative work, which was not the strength of Mies van der Rohe. Number one, to collaborative work. Number two, to looking at the environment, looking at insulation, looking at wind patterns, looking at the lay of the land. It's a completely different, if you want to go see an absolutely brilliant building in the Berlin area, rather than the National Gallery, the Mies van der Rohe masterpiece, go to Bernau, which is a small town northwest of Berlin, and go see the Bernau School by Hannes Meyer. It's absolutely brilliant, late 1920s. It's a completely different story. So I just want to emphasize that it's happenstance that this is what we think of as Bauhaus architecture.
But Don Bach has a time to the mid-60s. I think the graduate program was started in 1965 or 6 when it was actually put into action. And that meant the hiving off of the undergraduate program, which they called environmental studies. So the other aspect of my education here was my second year encounter with Claude Forrest and others. Peter Pan, of course, from Hong Kong, taught us that I kick you, but you don't die. So I'll never forget that. That's how he used to teach us. But we were making highly insulated, modular, livable units that we would design and build ourselves and sleep in at 35 below zero safely in 1979 or 1980. We had sociologists, biologists, sociologists. Jennifer Shea was, I can't remember her background, but we were given a really intense, broad, ecological education in those days. And we did projects that were climatically adaptive and responsive. That was really a big part of not part of the Bauhaus meter, but part of this kind of, the spirit of the day, the 1960s and 70s, the whole Earth catalog, the Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the whole kind of ethos of that era. And in that sense, we were, once again, I think, leading in North America for a program that taught the very principles, ironically, that are really persistent in our thinking at the moment. When we talk about sustainability, embodied energy, all those ideas. There was a movement here. It's not well recorded, but for us, it's a very familiar melody to hear.
I would be interested in looking at the genealogy of those professors. I can tell you that had Douglas Cardinal, the only important major indigenous architect of the 1960s and 70s, been hired here, we would have gotten that education in the direct line of Hannes Meyer, because after Douglas Cardinal, and this is all in the exhibition, went to UBC to study architecture, and the director there was a modernist, he encountered so much racism that he decided to go down to University of Texas, Austin, where he studied with Hugo Leipziger-Pierce, who was an environmentalist and a graduate of Hannes Meyer's Bauhaus. So in fact, that line could have been continued. But this is an example of the multifariousness of these lines of influence that eventually could come back here to haunt us nevertheless.
Just one clarification. I totally concur with what we're proposing here about the different avenues. And when I say that the Bauhaus, I don't feel so interested in the Bauhaus as a product, but more as a source.
Yes.
I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong in the fact that there is this, let's say, appeal to order that was expressed in the form of a new classicism, a new canon. And I always think and debate to what degree this is still necessary, and perhaps it is. But it is that precisely because we associate the Bauhaus with that image, we don't look into those other possibilities and those other branches or avenues for our own findings. So, yes, it is not pejorative against classicism necessarily. It is true as well that that was the easiest way to apply some of the principles of the Bauhaus to a capitalist and rationalist society.
And capitalist.
And capitalist society. And that's why Mies van der Rohe blossomed in the States, and the other guys simply didn't get a job.
Because the corporations figured out that it was the cheapest, most efficient way to build. Yeah. I think we're out of time. Oh, questions? Yes, we should open the floor for questions.
You guys have a very kind of historicist approach to your analysis of the Bauhaus, which is good. Until, I would say, 20, 25 years ago, if you would go to IIT, there was one way of doing architecture, which was Mies van der Rohe's architecture. It's not so much the case right now, but when I was there for a visit, I was shocked that, the late 90s, right? You would see the strong Bauhaus dogma, right? Still alive, let's say. For me, what I think needs to be built, of course, a celebration, but it's lacking a critique, because I feel that a lot of those processes and how they evolve, how they transfer, they have this power of imposition too in their ideology as well. I think for me the big question right now, and I'd like to provoke you guys is that what would be the most kind of meaningful critique of the Bauhaus for now, since that they became a highly dogmatic ideological movement. As a matter of fact, I don't think we suffer that much here with architecture education in Canada, which is in its first steps. But in Brazil, for example, which has a strong tradition, the ideology of the pedagogy is still what prevails, right? You design like this, right? And I don't know how we negotiate that ideology. I think it's still a question to be worked out. And I don't know what you guys think.
I guess I would just start off by saying ideologies, because what you encountered at IIT is Mies van der Rohe, and that's a very specific, I don't even know if I'd call it an ideology, it's an aesthetic. I guess it's an ideology too, and it's one of the very specific ones. When I visited Brasilia last summer, and I went to the architecture school there at the university, and I look around at the way the city is still being built, there's definitely an ideology of Niemeyer, essentially, and Burle Marx, let's say, that's very much alive. So I guess it's ideologies. But when you talk about an historicist bent, I think you're projecting my, to some extent, what my project now onto Carlos and Herb. I am definitely presenting an historicist perspective as a historian. But what I would say to that is the critique is absolutely essential, but you can't have a critique if you're not aware of the tradition. So first the awareness has to come, and the awareness, we live in forgetfulness. I mean, I know this. Sorry, go ahead.
You have the tradition, you have the awareness of the history and the tradition. So what's your critique then? For sure, for us, right? That's the only place to start.
Absolutely.
Critique. Then I ask you, Oliver, what's your critique of all?
Oh, it's not one critique, it's many critiques. And I could go on for hours about it. My personal, okay, I'll give you one. My personal research on my dissertation is on biocentrism. I focus on Hannes Meyer, always. I focus on Hannes Meyer's work. I focus on the influence of Raoul Francais on Hannes Meyer. To my mind, Hannes Meyer was the greatest of the three directors as an architect, not as a director. And to my mind, it's unfortunate that Hannes Meyer's approach, which was ecological avant la lettre, which was not as formalist, although it had its own formalism. It was not as formalist. It was much looser, much more open to the environment, has not been conveyed to a greater extent. So when Serena and I drove into Winnipeg in August of 1996, and we were driving along the Trans-Canada Highway, and I was driving a 24-foot U-Haul truck with all our books in there because our furniture didn't fit. And we were driving here because I got a job here, and we're looking left and right, and we're seeing little Miesian pavilions everywhere of a very high quality, higher than what we've ever seen in any place that we've ever lived. We were moving from Toronto. We were just bowled over by this. We were impressed by it, but that was not what I was personally working on. I continue to be impressed by it, like Carlos was when he came here, but yes, I can offer a critique of that, definitely.
Even like the presence of Hans Meyer, it would be a great thing because he's definitely kind of obscured, right, by the others.
Yes, and so I would say that it's unfortunate that Douglas Cardinal wasn't hired as an architecture professor here in the mid-1960s, that he wasn't poached the way others were poached from other schools when there was money here to hire whoever they wanted to hire.
Eduardo, the Bauhaus is a name for something, but it's also a historical process inevitably. It's something that happened not only by name, but in time, and it is not one entity. So the critique of the Bauhaus, perhaps, is what I just said, is that the Bauhaus the Bauhaus was hijacked by the person who killed the Bauhaus and kept the name of the Bauhaus as an identity. So that is the great paradox of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is not Mies, and it's not rationalist architecture, and it's a lot more than that. And we need to look at it in its components and different characters. But if you want me to tell you or to tell the audience what is that I miss the most about the Bauhaus is not even the ecological, which is super relevant, but the spiritual component of it. You know, the profoundly spiritual component that you found in people like Eaton, and the possibility of endow what we make with the soul, to take it to the real degree of art. Let's remember that the Bauhaus attempt was to put together art, craftsmanship, and industry in one, and that's a beautiful project. That is an unfinished one.
I think it's a perfect time to begin to ask ourselves where we are at the moment, because we've just come through a zenith of building in the city. And however hard the young firms, the small firms have worked, they've been, and however difficult it has been to establish a foothold in the design market in Winnipeg for the small firms, they've been more effective and more productive than any period, probably dating all the way back to the very 1950s that we're starting to talk about here. So there's been this blossoming of small and medium firms, and now with the complete collapse in the economy, it's likely that there's going to be a drying out period, I have to say. But I think we do need to be, at some point, self-critical and examine just what we've done. And this would be the perfect time for historians and social scientists even, and economists, to rake through the recent body of work that many here have participated in, including Eduardo, Neil, I see Thomas over there. He's had a quiet hand in destabilizing a number of projects here in Winnipeg. And there are others like, who are we? What are we doing? What have we done? The time is right to have another, let's say, to say post-Bauhaus is to actually still legitimize that as the historical precedent, which is probably a good idea, but to really sort of begin to understand just what's going on here and how we've collected our ideas and how we've put them into practice. It's a perfect time, it's harvest time now to go through those ideas and figure out a bit more critically what has happened, because design exercises are often in moments.
And I would just like to add one more thing to that, and that is that when Herb and Serena did that exhibition, they couldn't even get Heritage Winnipeg to advertise it in their newsletter. they couldn't even get them to place an ad in their newsletter. Think about that. So one of the things that I would say is, yes, the critique in the academy is extremely important. But towards the public, we have to continue to, in my view, to emphasize that this is a city with an extraordinary corpus of really high quality design buildings in little corners of the city, in strip malls, everywhere. There's no other city like this in this country. And we have to recognize this heritage, and we have to try and preserve it and try and respect it, at the very least, respect it. And you architects are the worst, I have to tell you, at historical preservation, because whenever you see a building that's about to be torn down, you see a possibility for something that you could design and make money off of. So I would just like to make a plug here for historical preservation, and for you to raise your voices the way you didn't raise your voices when our beautiful international airport was going to be torn down. I am shocked and appalled still by the response or the lack thereof of architects, and there are just not enough art and architectural historians in the city to have a kind of a loud enough voice. We have you have an amazing heritage here in the city. We have an amazing heritage. Let's respect it, whether it's neoclassical, whether it's Miesian, whether it's Breuerian, whatever it is. Let's respect it.
Yeah, I think that I don't have the last word.
Absolutely.
I don't want, but anyways, the outcome for when we did our Winnipeg Modern project, the airport was a fait accompli. I knew that it was coming down no matter what. There was no way around it. And that's why I put it on the cover, together with the 1959 Chevrolet limousine, to remind me of the car that my father drove in those days, which was just a two-door Biscayne, not the limo. Everything has a purpose. Everything has a purpose. But in the wake of that exhibition in the book, this building was completely redone, as precisely as possible to the character of the original drawings. The Monarch Life building was completely redone by one, from the ground up. Absolutely a treasured building, arguably Jim Donahue's best building. The Blue Cross building, right? In the book, you'll see a photograph of the light coming through because all the partitions have been taken off. The project was a part of a renewal of that building. The examples I'm talking about have no bearing on a historical designation. It's just that people began to recognize that, you know what, there is a heritage that's not just the post-war neoclassical movement that could be considered. And in fact, I gave a lecture at the fundraiser for the Historical Society. They wanted to know more about modern architecture and what made it modern. And the result of that was actually the salvaging and the saving of the St. Vital Library, that beautiful hexagon kind of treat of a building across from the YMCA, which had to do with other issues like the devolving of neighborhood libraries and consolidating them in large, more civic libraries that you had to drive through. So I could name countless examples of how that book was a part of, let's say, a kind of reconsideration and care for buildings of the post-war period. So I think the book had some merit in terms of inflecting the decisions of the owners of the buildings, not through legislation, but through revelation or understanding of their purpose.
Absolutely, and thank you for that effort. And that's why I'm doing this. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this. But I also think that your questions your questions about the critique of the Bauhaus are also very important, especially for practitioners. So, and I think that your emphasis on being aware of the sources, the multifarious sources in the Bauhaus, the attitude towards art, technology, and architecture of the Bauhaus. These are all very, very important aspects as well. So anyway, I invite all of you. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Can you remind us of the exhibition?
Yes. So I invite you all to come and look at the exhibition. It is at the School of Art Gallery, just over in the Patcow building, open 10 to 4 formally, but you can usually stay a little bit longer as well if people are there. In fact, if anybody wants to, I'd be happy to walk you over and give you a tour right now. This is completely spontaneous. If you do have time, I'm happy to go over there and give you a tour of the exhibition and show it to you. But it really is, and it goes much wider than what you've heard about here. It goes way beyond architecture, into fine art, into Marshall McLuhan, for example, into design, into interior design. There's a lot of, and to pedagogy as well. There's a lot of subjects that are covered in the exhibition, and I'd be happy to show you around.
I introduced you. I want to. What's the opposite of that?
Thank you.
Forget you? Yeah, to thank you, because you're the person around here who's kind of turning the soil, digging through the compost, and figuring out just what makes this place tick and what our roots are. That's the fundamental objective of your course. Nobody else is doing it. Certainly not with the intensity, knowledge, expertise, and devotion.
Jeffrey Thorsteinson.
Oliver, you are unique, and you're an absolute historical treasure. Thank you.